Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So, Jon, welcome. This is Jon Trapp, and Jon and I have worked together on search and rescue for about 15 years and live in the same small town of Red Lodge, share a lot of friends, and have done a lot of fun things together, including going to Yellowstone a couple weeks ago to look at some of the places that we're going to take people on our Yellowstone Wolf tour. So, Jon, I just wanted to, I'm just going to ask you some questions. And I know that you are a great speaker, so you can entertain everybody about wolves coming up. So tell us how you originally started working with wolves as a wildlife biologist.
Well, I was in the military. I was in the Air Force, and I was stationed overseas. And my first assignment was in Japan, and my next assignment was in Germany. But even before I went to Japan and Germany, I had always been interested in wolves. And so while stationed in Germany, there I had some weekends off, and there was rumors of wolves that were naturally recolonizing Eastern Germany. And there had been wolf sightings and wolf reports, and it was all very exciting. And so on weekends, I would get in my Jeep, and I would drive out to just random places out in Eastern Germany where I thought that the wolves, I'd look for forested areas and areas that there might be. Of course, I didn't have a lot of actual experience then to how to find them. And so I was really just kind of winging it. I'd go out there and look for a wolf sign, wolf tracks, and I'd howl. And then I'd go back to my day job of, we were involved with the war in Kosovo and things like that. So it's definitely one thing that wolves have always done for me. It's doing it right now. I'm actually in Sacramento at a tactical medic training, and it's definitely a completely different perspective. And wolves always re-ground me to what's important in so many ways. And so I can go do something like this, and even I was just before the call started, I was talking to a group of SWAT team, special forces medics, and all I wanted to know about was wolves, right? They're these like high speed, low drag sort of people, and but the conversation comes back to wolves, and I think wolves are really great at doing that. So when I had decided to get out of the Air Force and go use the GI Bill and get my master's degree in conservation biology and study wolves. And so I started with, went back to the States in Arizona, and I started working with the Mexican gray wolf, which is the most distinct subspecies of gray wolf, and in Arizona and New Mexico. And that was an active reintroduction program. From there, I started meeting the people. It's kind of a small group of people that, dedicate their lives to wolves. And I started to meet some of them, and I was offered to come to Idaho at first to be a mugger. And and so, well, I should explain what that means, right? So,
thank you.
During the winter is when often wolves are captured and radio collared, and so that's because the wolves can't run as fast in the snow, and it's easier for the helicopter to come in, and we would dart wolves. And the job of the mugger was to sit in the back seat of the helicopter, and once a wolf was darted, the helicopter would come in and dump me off in the middle of nowhere in Idaho, and with some snowshoes. And I would make my way over to the wolf that was very groggy, and put a radio collar on it and do we'd measure the canines, and we would draw blood, and just for the genetic research. And so I was lucky enough to kind of start off as a mugger with the Nez Perce Wolf program. And then they took me on to do my graduate research, which focused on wolf den site selection. So looking at, wolves have, an average home range in the Northern Rockies is 300-400 square miles. So the question that the biologists had is, why are these wolves choosing these particular spots? And one of the areas that we were able to go see, that I went with Chris to go see, is actually was one of number 9's old wolf dens, which Alan mentioned. So that the story of number 9 is a really interesting story. And so I'll back up wolf dens and selection. So I went all over the Northern Rockies. I stuck my head into over 30 wolf dens, usually when the wolves weren't there. But occasionally the wolves were still there. Sometimes we had to do pup counts. But looking at these attributes in Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, and even into Canada. So that was my graduate research. We were all over the place, with thousands of miles on a vehicle, and we hiked a lot and saw a lot. And from there, I was hired into the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Wyoming. And that's the agency that's in charge of administering the Endangered Species Act. So that was a direct tie to that program. And from there, I was hired into Montana and into Red Lodge through some maneuvering to work for the state of Montana in taking over the wolf management and tracking for the wolves. So that's how I kind of ended up in Red Lodge.
And how much time total did you work as a wolf biologist, Jon?
For 7 years as a wolf biologist. And in that process, I started teaching at the Yellowstone Institute and in the Lamar Valley. And then I transitioned into becoming a firefighter and a paramedic. But of course, I still do have a passion for wolves. So the Yellowstone Institute asked me to keep coming back and keep teaching it. And so twice a year for many years, I would come back and teach at the Yellowstone Institute. And the reason that I first considered that was there was a lot of wolf classes out there. You go to Yellowstone, there's all sorts of wolf people leading trips. But there was no one at the time that actually dealt with managing wolves outside of the park. So you have this, this wolf utopia of Yellowstone where wolves can run around and pretty much do whatever they want unless they start hanging around people too much and they get in trouble. But mostly the wolves are in charge in Yellowstone and the people are on the sidelines. And but that changes as soon as they put one paw outside of the park. And it's a dramatically different picture. And I really felt that I wanted to share that story with people, because there's a lot of people that love wolves and think they're amazing, which they are, but they were missing the rest of the story. And that's why I chose to have a class that really covered wolf ecology and management. And the management, I'll tell you what, it was not easy for a lot of people. I had people in my class cry more than once. And
Why?
it's not that it's funny, but it's the reality. I think we like a kind of a subset of what it's like, the life of a wolf. And when they step outside of the park, it is not an easy life. It's not an easy life inside the park. And so I really felt that I wanted people to understand the complexity of wolf management, the complexity of a landscape that was settled by ranching largely. If you look at how the West was settled, it was ranching, and it was timber, and it was mining, and it was extraction, and it was fully supported by the government. And so you have these sometimes small operations and ranches that mom and pop operations that literally, if they lose a cow, they might not be able to buy new clothing for their children. I mean, it's a tight margin for some people. I saw that side of it. I saw ranchers working hard. They'd get up at 6 in the morning and they'd work till 10 o'clock at night, or they'd get up even earlier when it gets light early in Montana. For those of you who'd like to travel more in Montana, I mean, it's like light at 4:30 in the morning in the summertime. So you can get out and get after it for sure. But so I really wanted people to go home from this course understanding that it's not all rainbows and sunshine. And the reality of managing wolves and trying to live with wolves on the landscape is a very challenging. And that's why I continued teaching it, because I was still the only voice that had that experience, because I had worked in all the states surrounding the park. I had worked in Arizona and New Mexico, and I had worked with ranchers a lot. And I found that the best thing for wolves and was to tell the truth. Really, like, if you shouldn't sugarcoat it, and you shouldn't have a different presentation for the different people you talk to. Because I talked to pro-wolf groups, I talked to anti-wolf groups, I talked to hunters, I talked to educators, talked to lawmakers, I talked to the whole spectrum, and my presentation was the same. Because at the end of the day, you have to have factual information out there, not hearsay and not rumors and not, things that don't have a lot of grounding. The best thing that you can do for the wolves, and that's what people always ask me, like, what can I do to help wolves? I'm assuming that a lot of you probably like wolves. But if you don't, that's okay too. I like wolves. People ask what they could do for wolves. And I said, the best thing you can do is get information that is peer-reviewed research, factual information, and share the facts. Don't sugarcoat it, and don't, tell myths to people who you're trying to change their mind. And the reality is, a lot of times you're not going to change their mind. We've seen that in our political climate, right? We've seen it's pretty hard to change people's minds, and there's a lot of politics that go into wolf management, and economics and sociology and culture and biology. And that's the thing that I found, that the wolf is the most valuable tool to share all those stories with us, to put it all into one package in us as humankind, figuring out how to live with this amazing creature that is not really easy to live with. So, yeah.
I'm going to come back to wolves, but real quickly, you put your wolf biology career on the back burner and then became a firefighter. Why did you make that change, and how does your wolf background affect what you do now? Or how does it tie in, I guess I should say?
So one of the job requirements with wolves, I was always jealous of the bear biologists because the bears hibernated and they got a break. So the wolves don't hibernate; they just keep doing their thing. And so it was pretty much year round that the phone would ring and there would be some sort of conflict that I would have to go deal with. And then we worked really hard to put radio collars on wolves. And the way I did it was trapping, leg hold trapping, that were special traps that were designed not to injure the wolves. And so from May till October, I was trapping and radio collaring wolves, and I'd be gone for 2 weeks, and I'd be out, and I'd be in a remote area in the wilderness, someplace, often without cell service. And I was married, and I had a new daughter and another one on the way. And I quickly realized that that lifestyle was no longer conducive to being a father. And so I had to make some decisions that would enable me to be with my pack, right? So to say. And the fire department, I was already on the fire department as an EMT and as a volunteer, and I was on search and rescue as a volunteer. And they said, hey, you should apply for this firefighter paramedic position. And I said, well, I'm not either one of those. And they said, well, we will train you and you can be home with your family almost every night. And I said, okay. So I made that transition. I remember one of the first IVs I started on a human. They're like, have you started an IV before? And I said, well, yeah, lots of times, but only on wolves. You're the first human. And that was a fun to see that reaction. But if you can start IVs on wolves, you can start them on humans. It's easier. So I made that transition because of my family and putting my family first. And but I always have that love of wolves, and we'll see what the future holds. And I became a structure firefighter, paramedic, and a wildland firefighter. And in wildland fire, I started to see these relationships between, fire is a huge impact. It's a change agent in our environment. And so are wolves. Wolves are a keystone predator that have a huge impact on the landscape, down to the structure and the bugs in the soil. So now I switched from a large a thing that impacted the environment largely to another thing, wildfire. And I started to see these really interesting relationships between wildfire and how it affected the landscape, and wolves and how they affected the landscape. And there was one time I was teaching my wolf class in Yellowstone, and Druid Peak was on fire. Now, those of you know wolves know the Druid Pack were one of the probably most famous wolf pack. And they came out of the Rose Creek pen, the acclimation pen that's still in Yellowstone. They came out the year after number 9 came out of that same acclimation pen. So number 9 was in 95, she was in the Rose Creek Pack. She immediately beelined to Red Lodge. And then she had her pups there. They had pups on the mountain right outside of Red Lodge on Mount Maurice. So the next year, the Druids came out of that same acclimation pen, and very famous pack, and lots of great videos and stories that Bob Landis has done on them, National Geographic films. And I was watching the wolf pack in the Lamar Valley while the Druid Peak was on fire behind me, and I was like, all right, I gotta tie this all together. And the following year, I started teaching a course called Forces of Nature, Wolves and Fire. And it started talking about how we've evolved with both wolves and fire, and the very interesting management history that went with them. If you think about how we excluded fire from the landscape, we did the same thing to wolves, right? The only in the early 1900s and before, the only good wolf was a dead wolf. That was the saying. And the last wolves were killed out of Yellowstone in the early 1900s. And we also, after the fires of 1910, started to a heavy fire suppression program where we excluded fire from the landscape. So now we've taken these two incredible change agents that affect our ecosystem so deeply and removed them from the landscape. And what did that do to our landscape? Well, we're seeing the results of what 100 years of fire suppression has done for us. We're seeing these massive fires. They're not only tied to climate change, but they're tied to 100 years of fire suppression. Mm-hmm. So, which allows the natural forest fuels to build up in ways that never happened prior to fire management. And so those two, I think, are really amazing. There's a lot to it, to wolves and fire and climate change. And
yeah, now the prevailing thought has changed on both of those things. So if you can, we've got about 5 more minutes here. We don't want to keep people too long, but can you give us a brief history of the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone after they eradicated?
Yeah, so they were eradicated or extirpated from the lower 48, and the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1971. It says that if a species is missing from all or a significant portion of its historic range, it's eligible for listing under the Endangered Species Act. So the wolves obviously were, because they covered most of the lower 48 and were completely removed from, except for a population in northern Michigan. And so they definitely met the criteria, and in 1973 they were listed, one of the first species listed under the Endangered Species Act. So they were protected, and nothing happened for a long time. In 1980, wolves started naturally recolonizing from Canada into northwest Montana. So there was a population limping along there for many years, for 15 years. And of course, it was a big deal. A lot of politics involved with dropping a large carnivore back onto the landscape. And so there was a lot to that story. There were a lot of sides to the story and a lot of angry people. And so, but finally in 1995, it was able to go forward with that introduction program, and wolves were captured in Canada. Some say, oh, they're exotic species. I'll just say that, hey, when you have a species that disperses over 300 miles, that's not how that works. They weren't exotic. And we had wolves come out of Canada routinely and end up in Montana. So they're not exotic. They're just gray wolves, Canis lupus. And so they were captured. Around that time that was happening in 95, I was actually overseas in Japan in the Air Force. So I wasn't there for that, which served me later as a wolf biologist with dealing with ranchers. Because you brought those wolves here, they'd yell at me, and I'd say I was actually serving in the military overseas, and they would, well, thank you for your service. So they went from being mad at me to being they would listen, and so it worked well to open doors that would have otherwise been closed. And so 95 and 96, they captured the wolves. They introduced them into Yellowstone in acclimation pens and into the central wilderness, Frank Church Wilderness. And there was over 66 wolves that were released during those 2 years. There was supposed to be a third year, but fairly quickly they realized that, hey, these wolves are doing all right. We don't think we need to introduce anymore. So they have been doing very well, and Yellowstone maintains a population of around 100 wolves. That's been pretty stable for 20 some years. So occasionally the numbers go up and down, but overall they hang around 100 wolves.
Okay. And one last question for you, Jon, before we take questions from everybody else. Can you explain how wolves are an apex predator species in the phenomenon of trophic, I don't know if I said that right, cascade?
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of question, and it comes down to, I just had one of the questions that was asked of me is like, do you have to control the wolves? Where if you don't do anything, will their numbers get so high that they take over the earth, essentially? And that would be what would be considered a top-down regulation system, where the top carnivore affects the prey, which affects the grass, which affects the soil, top down. That's considered a trophic cascade. Bottom up would be a situation where green, healthy grass allows more elk to reproduce, which then allows more wolves to exist on the landscape. So trophic cascades is the movement up and down in that system and how they affect. And a keystone species is at the top and affects everything down the system and across the system. And a wolf is such a creature. So there's trophic cascades and how that affects landscape, and then we see that all the way down into the behavior of elk. And so in Yellowstone, we'll go to some places where you'll see where willow and cottonwood have regenerated in areas that hadn't for a long time, because wolves are now back in the system, which change the behavior of the elk, which allows the cottonwood and the willow to regenerate, which allows beaver to return to the system and songbirds. And so that's the trophic cascade and how things go up and down the system. And that's something that we as humans are continuing to try to understand.
All right. Thanks, Jon. I'm just going to read some of the questions, and those of you who are watching and listening, there is a little button that says "Ask a Question" on here. If you've got a question for Jon or any of us, feel free to just write it down, and then let's see here. The first one is, if we come on the wolf tour with Zephyr, what will we be doing with you on the tour?
Good. So there is as I mentioned, there's the den site that number 9 had pups in one year. So doing a snowshoe out to that den site and seeing the den site up close, or potentially another den site. I think it's always fun I like to go to den sites. Obviously, that's how I did my graduate research, and it becomes really the core of activity for the wolf pack for not only the denning season, but the whole year. So dens are really important when it comes to conservation and, of course, obviously reproduction, successful reproduction. Another thing would be visiting the acclimation pen, where the wolves were introduced. It's a magical place, and to think about the level of excitement that those had being there when they brought the wolves in 95 and put them in these acclimation pens. Just what a monumental effort and accomplishment from a species that was listed in 1973 to finally in 1995 seeing, wolves being introduced onto the landscape. And then, as a wolf biologist, you got to get up early and go out and look for wolves, and you got to go out at the end of the day and look for wolves and set up spotting scopes and observe behavior and tie in with the wolf network of people that are out there that are friends of mine and say, hey, what's going on? Where should we go? What's been happening? And often the story will be like, oh, this amazing thing, like 30 wolves just came over here and they took down a bison, and then a bear came over and fought him off, and then this happened and this happened, and then you just come out and everything's quiet on the Western Front. So timing is everything, but Yellowstone and the Lamar Valley are one of the highest likelihood of seeing wolves in North America.
Somebody asked, have you ever socialized a wolf from a young age?
So I have not. That is something that's obviously how we ended up with dogs and through selective breeding over time. Wolves are amazing social creatures that just like those that have seen a puppy, that puppy opens its eyes for the first time and sees a human, there's going to be a connection there. So wolves are not meant to be our pets. I don't recommend having a wolf as a pet. And hybrids can be a challenge, although I know some people that have some wonderful wolf hybrids. Sometimes you mix some different breeds together, and it's not necessarily a great thing to have the hybrid. And so I think we have to. When I was working as a wolf biologist, we had people that had wolf hybrids, and they were too much for them to handle. So they would go out to where there were wolves and open the crate and release their domestic hybrid dog into the wild to go be with the wolves. And those of you know how wolves work, that they did not live very long because wolves fiercely defend their territory. So I love dogs. I've got a Malamute, and before that I had a Husky, and they're very similar to wolves, and so I have socialized them.
Okay. Another question. That previous one was from Jill. Hi, Jill. And then we have one from Tamara, who actually lives in Red Lodge. She wants to know what the wolf pack situation is around Red Lodge currently. Are there any pack activity or sightings around Red Lodge?
So there is continued pack activity across the front, the Beartooth Mountains, which you lead trips into, and there's continuous wolf activity across the front. What we see with a landscape where you have a forested mountainous area that immediately meets open rangeland or cultivated land, or whether it's crops or something that we're growing, or it's livestock grazing, as soon as the wolves come off the mountains, they're in high conflict areas. So wolves learn fairly quickly to stay tight to the forested areas and tight to the mountains when they leave the park. So because of that, we have a really weird elongated home range for wolves that operate outside of Yellowstone and around Red Lodge. Their home range is still several hundred square miles, but it's very elongated, and it's kind of runs along the face, and it looks something like that, as opposed to like in the park, you'll see home ranges that look something, like that. And so there's constant wolf activity. I see wolf sign often on my hikes, either tracks or scats. Sometimes I've even heard them. I've heard them howling from my hot tub at night, which overlooks Mount Maurice, where number 9 had her pups. So yeah, still activity.
Very cool. And then we're kind of at our time limit. So if you not you, John, you stay on, but if any of you want to log off, feel free. We've got a couple more questions, and then we'll let you go if you're interested in hearing these last two. This is from Lori. She says, what's the most successful method for ranchers to live harmoniously with wolves? She said, when I spoke with ranchers a while ago, they said that range riders or having human presence out with the livestock was most effective. Do you agree with that?
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. And I do agree with that. I have been involved with many research projects for non-lethal methods to keep wolves out of livestock. And there's a lot of different ones out there. But range riders, I think, are the most effective. And again, if you think about the way we settled the West, and we wiped out the predators and the carnivores from the landscape largely, so that we could have these huge areas where livestock are out on the landscape, allotments, private land, thousands of acres. Because the further north you go, the less biomass you're going to get from your soils and nutrients, and so you have to range pretty big areas, the livestock, and so by killing all the predators, we could let them do that. They could go out in allotments and either government land or private land and range huge areas, and then the ranchers would put them out there for months and then pick them up and move them to another allotment. And so that's the way we kind of set up a standard for generations of ranchers. And then we kind of threw wolves back in the mix, and people just, why don't they just, change what they're doing or suck it up or figure it out? Well, they don't. A lot of these ranchers don't have the money to buy another ranch hand. So there have been organizations over the time that provide funding for range riders, and that those organizations come and go. The Predator Conservation Alliance did that for a while, and then they were called Keystone Defenders of Wildlife. And so there are some organizations that do that, but it involves, and I've done the job, it involves sleeping with the cattle and being out on the landscape with them, and you got to get up all night, and if you hear the cows bawling, you got to get up on your horse or your ATV and go. And I've got some pretty wild stories of nighttime adventures chasing wolves on an ATV. So, but it is very intensive. But if we could do it, we can get more range riders, which also help the ranchers mend fences and bring in and round up the cattle. And that's a win-win, I think, for everyone. The ranchers can even see the benefit of trying to, they just want to keep their livestock alive. But then most of them don't hate wolves. They just say, you know what? I don't care if the wolves are there. I just don't want them killing my livestock.
Yeah, understandable. So last question for you, John. Would you agree that the Lamar Valley is one of the best places in the world to have a chance to observe or view wolves?
Yes, definitely. It's got all the attributes, and things change over time and seasonally. And, because you have the northern elk herd has winter range and summer range. And then they have calving areas. And then there's bison and pronghorn. The pronghorn have come back in great numbers because the wolves have been back, which have reduced the numbers of coyotes, which were the number one prey for the pronghorn calves. They were preying on the pronghorn calves. And so you have a very dynamic landscape. You have wildfire that burns through areas, and after a wildfire burns through the areas, it can affect moose habitat, or it does a huge nutrient release, which draws in even more elk and deer to come in and get that really nutrient-rich browse. So it varies from the seasonality, and year to year. But that place historically is the premier crown jewel of wolf viewing for sure.
Yeah. which is just a quick plug for our upcoming wolf tour, which is at the end of March. That is actually now sold out. We sold that trip out in, I think, one day. So we're really grateful, John, that you were able to join us tonight and share your knowledge. And I'm really looking forward to showing people Yellowstone on snowshoes with you for a couple of days talking about wolves. I think it's going to be a really fun time. So thanks everyone for joining us tonight. Appreciate you spending your evening or part of your evening with us. And I have one more question. Somebody wants to know if you can give us your best wolf howl.
I might attract the law enforcement if I did that here, or bother my neighbors. But I do have a good wolf howl. It's definitely better in person. So
Okay.
hit me up in person, and I'll do the wolf howl for you.
All right. Well, I hope that you'll be able to join us for future trips, because I know there are a lot of people who would love to do this. And now, because this March trip is sold out, I hope you'll give us some time next year. Maybe we can run a couple more trips with you. So,
Sounds great.
all right. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Mm-hmm.